Hello, I'm Sandy Allerheiligen, and I'm one of the pastors here at the village. I want to share with you one of the folk tales that my family has always shared every Christmas and every Easter. You've probably heard it. It's the tale of three trees. There were three young trees growing on a hillside, and they were talking about what they wanted to be when they grew up. The first one wanted to be a treasure chest, covered with jewels and holding great treasure. The second one wanted to be a strong sailing vessel and sailing the seas and carrying great kings. And the third one said, "Oh, all I ever want to be is a magnificent tree pointing people to God." And as they grew into magnificent trees, one day the woodcutters came. And first tree was cut down, and then the second, and then the third tree. Her heart sank. They cut her down. Well, they were brought down the mountain, and the first tree was taken to a carpenter's shop. And she thought, oh, good. But instead of being made into a treasure chest, she was made into a rough-horned manger. And she was covered with dirt and straw. And the second tree went to a shipbuilder's. And he thought, oh, wow, I'm going to be made into a sailing ship. But unfortunately, they weren't building any big ships that day. And he was made into a small little fishing vessel that was only big enough to sail on a lake. And then finally, the third tree was the most confused of all. The woodcutter said, oh, it doesn't matter what happens here. And he cut her into just various sizes of beams and threw her on the pile and left her there. Well, the years went on, and they'd almost forgotten their dreams. And suddenly, one night, a young couple appeared in the stable. The woman was having a baby. And the father said, oh, this manger will do. And they placed the baby in the manger. And the tree said, oh, I'm holding the King of Kings. I'm holding the greatest treasure of all. Well, years passed, and one night the little boat was on the sea, and it was an immense storm. And the waves just buffeted the ship. And he said, I can't hold it together. I'm just not strong enough against these winds. And suddenly the master of the group awakened and told the storm to be quiet and to still. And the ship said, I'm strong. I can do this. And he got them to safety. He knew where his strength came from. Well, a few years passed, and then one Friday, the little tree felt her beams being grabbed and pulled off the pile. And she was carried through the streets of jeering crowds. She had never felt so ugly. And she was carried through that street up to the top of a hill. And a man's hands were hammered into her beams. She felt alone, rejected, and so confused. And then Sunday morning came, and she knew above all things that when people now looked at her, they would see God. They would see what God had planned. And each of these 3 trees realized that God had fulfilled their dreams in ways they could never have imagined. One held the Prince of Peace at his birth. One, Christ and the disciples through the storm. And one on the cross to save us all. And you know, that's the gift of disappointment. And it's so important that we know in our disappointments, whether they're little bitty or huge, that we don't know the truth of the dream until the other side of heaven. That God has a plan, and we have a choice. We can look to the Lord. We can look to our brothers and sisters on each side of us. They can help us walk through it. So I think of my dad when I think of people who had dreams. That Dad was playing in the minor leagues, baseball, before World War II. And he got wounded in World War II. He was the only man that made it back from his unit out of the Pacific. But he was never able to play baseball again. And yet he was always positive, looking for what God did instead. And he always laughed. He thought he'd make it in the majors. He'd played against Ted Williams in the Navy. But God had another plan. And that's what he wants us to do. Have trust in his plan. And I hope you enjoyed the story of the 3 trees as we go through Advent, and I wish you a very Merry Christmas.